kann. Also diese Bilder im Kopf von diesen Folgerungen plus diesen Begriffen, die man sehr, sehr gerne anders füllen würde. Ich würde da noch gerne eine Sache sozusagen Michael auffordern, zu eine andere Antwort gebe, ist, in dem Buch steht irgendwo, ja, Revolution ist auch monströs. Und das, was es verlangt, ist monströs. Vielleicht könnten Sie dazu noch was sagen. Ich glaube, es ist eine Antwort auf die Frage, auch zu sagen, was es nämlich voraussetzt, diese Art von Revolution, die Sie propagieren.
Yeah.
Monströs.
No, the monstrous part is interesting, but part of what you were saying, though, was repeating in a way what you started with, was that war is peace, peace is war. It's the same kind of, let's say, distortion of the vocabulary that you find with Abu Ghraib and democracy. What we meant, I mean, it was in a way fitting with this discussion about identity that we were working with a few minutes ago. You know, I find often in discussions about revolution that people assume that the revolution will finally bring out the world in which I, as I am, will finally fit. But I think of revolution, on the contrary, as the construction of a world in which none of us fit as we are now. In fact, that we have to precisely be transformed. And that's part of what liberation would be, that kind of transformation, in order to live in this changed world. And I think it's important to recognize how painful also that is, and even horrifying. I mean, when we think back to questions of identity, we are all extremely attached to forms of identity and you don't recognize how attached you are until you try to give them up and to live without them. And that, I mean, even, so, yeah, we were referring earlier before to Wendy Brown's notions of identity as relation to a kind of attachment to these wounds, you know, an attachment to forms of subordination, and in which Wendy Brown is critiquing certain strains within the U.S. feminist movements of a kind of attachment to, and certainly within African American movements too, other race insubordination movements, there is an attachment to that state of injury, and in part the revolution involves, in a way, an abandonment of what we've known ourselves to be.
Ja, das sollte man vielleicht mal sagen, also neben all dem wirklich sehr optimistischen und ja auch wirklich dynamischen Konzept dieses Buchs ist es keineswegs so, dass man bei diesem Begriff von Revolution sicher sein kann, welches politisches Objekt da am Ende von sozusagen profitiert. Es ist nicht eine klassische Vorstellung, wie wir es vielleicht kennen. Es ist sozusagen die Arbeiterklasse, die führt sozusagen zur Befreiung zunächst mal ihrer eigenen und dann möglicherweise etablieren sich aber eben wieder neue unterdrückende Machtstrukturen. Das einerseits befreiende und gleichzeitig aber eben auch monströse dieses Begriffs von Revolution ist, dass niemand mehr weiß, was für eine Art von Subjekt er sein wird im Durchgang durch diese Art von Revolution, die da vorgeschlagen wird. Also das ist wirklich monströs.
That is monstrous, yes.
Ja, da oben der Herr, wir netterweise warten, dauert ein bisschen, bis Sie das Mikrofon haben. Können Sie noch einmal Handzeichen geben?
She's running.
Ja. We'll see this. We should have two on it.
Yeah, that's good. It was on. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh no, it was on, but that's not now. Okay, maybe it is. Okay, never mind. Yeah.
Continue.
So just to continue where you were in this discussion, isn't it possibly so that the structures in which we live today interpolate us in a way that we have a subjectivity that does not even allow us anymore to do a revolution?
Yeah.
And what does that mean for a strategy of change? Isn't it that you might run theoretically into one-way street where we end up all being happily in the conditions in which we live because of that type of structures that subjectivize us into the status quo.
In theory, I mean, one could say, I'm not sure if this is the right way to respond. Let me try. If it's wrong, then we can't say it. But I mean, in theory, one could say, or one reads many arguments too, that capitalist society has such flexibility to be able to incorporate all revolt, to be able to turn it back as marketing, to be able to work with all differences, etc. But in fact, people do revolt. I mean, I think that maybe that's the. In some ways, it's not that theoretical reflections should inspire people to revolt. I think it's rather we need to understand how people are revolting against their current conditions and try to work with and interpret that. I mean, so it could happen that, or one could imagine, or we even see many films of this sort of thing, that there's a completely functional and dominating society that can digest and interpret all sorts of and even allow spaces. I mean, I was thinking of that. You know, at the end of Kant's little essay about enlightenment, where he says that Frederick says, "Yes, debate all you want, as long as you obey." And that's, you can sort of see that maybe that's, I think what you're hypothesizing is that's the kind of, perhaps that's the world we live in, where people debate all they want, make little shows of things, but in the end obey. Okay, or am I misunderstanding?
Wenn ich darf, ich glaube, der Punkt ist problematischer. Also wenn ich das aufnehmen darf, würde ich sagen, die Frage ist doch, ob Individuen oder Gruppen im Moment geprägt, wie wir sind von einer bestimmten Gesellschaft und von bestimmten politischen Strukturen überhaupt in der Lage sind, diese Art von, wenn wir den Spinoza-Begriff nehmen, Begehren zu denken, der nötig ist, um sozusagen zu revoltieren. Man kann es auch anders sagen, wir würden doch glauben, dass Begehren oder die Vorstellungen von dem, wie wir sein wollen oder wie wir leben wollen, auch nicht einfach sozusagen frei geschaffen werden, sondern die sind ja ebenfalls wieder konditioniert und kodiert und vorgeprägt und also wir sind ja auch die Vorstellung davon, wer wir sein wollen, werden ja auch gebildet durch Drehbücher, durch Filme, durch Literatur. Genau das ist ja zum Teil genau der Ansatz von diesem Buch zu sagen, wir schaffen erstmal ein neues Vokabularium. Die Frage, also wenn ich Sie richtig verstanden habe, war noch zu sagen, ist das nicht möglicherweise ein richtiges Problem für einen solchen Entwurf, wenn man feststellen würde, vielleicht sind die Leute viel zu ängstlich oder viel zu gefangen in bestimmten Vorstellungen von sich selbst, um sowas denken zu können. Ist Sie ganz ungefähr?
Yeah, I mean, both. This is extending further, I think, the comment. I was well. You see, I mean, I would almost like to respond. It's almost out of character to respond in an empirical way rather than in a theoretical way, because I think we have to. You know, let me put it this way. You know, I find myself often confronting people in instances when they say, well, there are no social movements anymore, no one is revolting, no one is rebelling. And I sort of think, well, what have you been looking at? You know, like, because in my world, there are a lot of people, social movements, people rebelling, movements, etc. And I feel like maybe it's a kind of invisibility, you know, that one has to recognize that the ways in